In the last 10 or so talks, we've been looking at issues of form in architecture, and form of all sorts, form that speaks to your heart and soul and senses, form that speaks to your head and your brain and your intellect. We looked at how do you make architectural form, what are the sources of architectural form. We've tried to hit a number of topics about form. And today is a talk that tries to pull those together, to look at a synthesis of all of those things. And what is a building like that's really sophisticated in terms of its architectural form? In this talk, we're going to be really looking at two buildings, and we're going to look at them kind of in the same order of issues as we've had in the talks, and kind of looking at each of the things we talked about and how the building deals with that. And then in sum, to see what does that contribute to making a building that's really rich and wonderful and memorable and powerful in terms of form. So the first building we're going to look at is St. Ignatius Chapel at Seattle University in Seattle, Washington. The architect is Stephen Hall. It was completed in 1998. Stephen Hall he's now like one of the best known architects in the world and very, very successful architect. But this was in his kind of early career, and this was a really important building for him. He actually grew up in the Seattle region, and then he went to University of Washington as an undergrad, went to graduate school at Harvard and at the AA in London, came back to New York, was teaching at Columbia University, set up his practice in New York, really successful, bright, rising young architect. And then this opportunity came up for this chapel in his hometown, and of course, he was dying to get that job. And in the end, he did get it, and just poured his heart and soul into making a relatively small building, but one that just was as resonant and wonderful as it possibly could be. So this building was on a tiny site, and it's a small building. It is at it's at the end of a long axis, and the other end of the axis is the student center of the university. And obviously, a student center is, it's a big building, and it's an important building, and its function makes it very central to the university. The chapel was a very small building, but because this is a private university, it sounds like a public university, but it's actually a Catholic university, because they're based in religion, they wanted the chapel to be a very special building too. So at one end of the axis is the student center, big and loud, and at the other end of the axis is this tiny building that needed to use architectural form to give it a great deal more presence. So the site was a little rectangular lot that they filled like this. We're looking down that axis. There's a beautiful reflecting pool, a little tower, and then the chapel building just like that. The chapel is very, you could just think of it in terms of the elements of form, and it's got very powerful elements of form. It's got very strong shape to it, obviously. It's got incredible sense of space on the inside, really powerful, lively, interesting spaces in there. It's a building that's very strong in terms of light, all kinds of light qualities. Sometimes light just creeps in little bits of light. Sometimes light is very dramatic and bold and strong. Very many different light qualities in the building. It's also a building that has interesting use of color. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but there are moments where it's a very lively, bright, colorful building. We could look at other elements of form like texture. You can already see on the ceiling there this interesting texture in the plaster. The color that we're seeing in that previous slide is actually a reflection off of a plane here where the sun comes in. It hits a yellow surface, and then it gives this kind of yellow glow around there. That texture is evident in many other places in the plaster, in the windows. They have textured art glass in there. So if you just took the elements of form, color, light, shape, space, texture, many, many strengths. It's a beautiful building in terms of just exercising the elements of form. Then in the lecture after, or the talks after, we talked about the senses. We were looking at form that spoke more to the intellect. And in this case, again, it's a building that is meant very much to speak to your intellect. As I said, this is a Catholic university. The chapel is called St. Ignatius Chapel. St. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order in the Catholic Church is well known for its education. This is a Jesuit university. So St. Ignatius was this important person to think about in this chapel. So Stephen Hall did a lot of thinking about that. He read everything he could get his hands on that St. Ignatius wrote. He tried to understand the philosophy of St. Ignatius and to really understand, well, how could we maybe translate that into the architecture of the building? This is intellectual thought. This is ideas of St. Ignatius. How could we actually embed them into the building? So St. Ignatius had this philosophy about life, actually a beautiful philosophy about life. St. Ignatius said that life is filled with good times and bad times, and one can't expect, just as a religious person, to uniformly have happy times all the time. There are going to be bad things that happen in life. And he called these consolations and desolations. Consolations, the good parts of your life; desolations, the sad parts of your life. And he said consolations and desolations are like light. That there are moments when light is very, very wonderful and important, but you also need darkness. And in order to understand light, you need to have darkness. And that combination of light and dark makes the world the way it is. And that combination of good times and bad times really makes our lives what they are. So it's natural to have this cycle of consolations and desolations. It's kind of a beautiful philosophy. So he wrote that in the words that he conveyed to the future. And that very much is an attitude of the Jesuit order. In this building, Stephen Hall kind of embraces that. And he said, we're going to make a building that's all about light and darkness, about consolations and desolations, about the contrast between these two sides of our experience of life. So the building is very much about catching light. This is an early sketch he did about catching light and moving it into the building in various ways. And in the end, the building is very much about the light qualities of various parts of the building. So in that way, it was intellectual. Also, we talked about buildings expressing a sense of order. That's a kind of intellectual notion, and it's very clear this one has the order of the simple rectangle that contains the whole building, the order of the simple rectangular fountain, the order of the tower on the axis. All of those things, very regular, orderly. It certainly has that content. But it also has complexity. Within that order, there is irregularity, circumstantial things. In some ways, you could see it like the chapel at San Carlo alla Quattrofontana, where there's a little bit of an argument between the kind of order of the site and the regularity in the axis, and this kind of serendipity and irregularity of these light scoops and elements that shape the top of the building. It also is a building that talks about technique, about the way it's made, and we're meant to, with our head, sort of work through that. Stephen Hall initially wanted to make the whole building out of this beautiful golden stone called Mankato stone from Minnesota. But alas, he had a relatively low budget and he couldn't afford the Mankato stone. So he decided to make it out of what's called tilt wall construction. And this is a very down and dirty, almost industrial kind of construction. But it's concrete, but the way you make it is you pour a slab of concrete, and then on that slab you put down a piece of polyethylene plastic. And then you outline in 2x8s or 2x12s or whatever the shape of a wall that you want to make. And then you put reinforcing bars in there, you pour the concrete, and it just levels out like a second slab on top of that first slab. And when it cures, then it's a wall that you can tilt up and make a good simple wall. Now, that's a lot easier than building formwork on both sides and supporting it all and putting the rebars in there and then trying to pour the concrete in the top, all of which is very labor intensive. But the tilt wall way of doing it is simple and actually quite economical. So he decided to build the building out of tilt wall. And the tilt wall here is colored, the color of that Mankato stone. You see the kind of irregularities of the concrete there. They would have poured that just as a simple form like this down as a slab, and then they would have put little wire hoops at those 4 points. Those were called pick points. And then you'd take a cherry picker or something like that, and you'd pick that up from the slab and tilt it up like this. And when they put it in place, it would then leave those little wire hoops out here, which are unsightly. In an industrial building, they often just clip it off, and it's just a wound in that concrete wall. But Stephen Hall comes back and covers those pick points with this beautiful little brass knob that begins to make that process of construction both visible and kind of celebrated. So the technology of how it's built had very much to do with the way he could make the shapes of these elements, but also it had to do with the kind of ornament of those little brass knobs that are on the building. So intellectually, he's talking to us about order, he's talking to us about complexity, and he's talking to us about technique or the technology of building. We also, in a couple of other talks, we were interested in this notion of the underlying structure of something. How is it that architecture is so fundamentally about finding this concept or this scheme, as we talked about in the Beaux-Arts, what they called the équisse, or this underlying structure of what this design was going to be. And that is very much part of the process that Stephen Hall uses to do his design. He's genius, I think, at finding just the right underlying structure by which to design his buildings. So in this case, he came up with this conceptual idea of the chapel being 7 bottles of light. So again, going back to St. Ignatius and the consolations and desolations, he wanted these radically different light qualities. And he's thinking there really are 7 fundamental functions in this building. And for each of those functions, I'm going to find just the right light quality. And I'm going to make 7 bottles of light that accumulate to be the chapel on the inside. So that drawing is this notion of, at that point, he's thinking of that Mankato stone around there. And then inside these 7 bottles of light, each of them representing a different function in the building. And that's really what it became, is this very irregular combination of shapes and forms that are bringing light into the building in very different ways. So let's walk through those 7 bottles of light. The first of these is what he called procession, which is that bottle right there. You walk in the front door, And immediately there's a slice of light that draws you into the building and sucks you in. So procession is the first bottle of light right there. Then immediately adjacent to that is the narthex. And that narthex is it's the room where the congregation gathers before and after the service. It's got a more normal light quality. It's got a window that looks out to that reflecting pool and down the axis, and you can see the student center in the distance down there. And then to balance that light from the edge wall there's another skylight on the other side of the narthex to make a good, even, natural light, the kind of light that would be lovely to talk to your friends in, and just a general illumination of the room. So the narthex is the second bottle of light. The third bottle of light is the baptistry. And that's this beautiful little moment here where there's very soft light coming in from the side. It's actually quite dark in this area, very serene, and just the right mood for that moment of baptism. The fourth bottle of light is the sanctuary and the altar. This is a very different mood. This is about celebration and the Mass, and so there's volume and color and light, and a completely different bottle of light than, say, the baptistry. And then the next bottle of light is the communion space, which is right here. And the light comes in at the top, otherwise it's no windows on the other sides. It hits a surface that's red. The light bounces off of that red surface and just bathes the whole space in kind of blood red light down there. And that, of course, is representing the blood of the communion. So you process from the sanctuary into this little room, take the communion there, and go back to the sanctuary. But that little moment is the sixth bottle of light. That's the fifth bottle of light, I think. The sixth one is this little moment right here, which is the confessional. You open that door right there, the light comes from above, and that is just straight down from above, as if God's up there looking down at you. There's a little curtain between you and the priest, but the confession is in that very closed space with a light coming from above. And then the seventh bottle of light is this choir area over here, actually kind of artificially lit, not natural light over there, very even light, but also not meant to call attention to the choir, to let them be a kind of adjunct to the other space. So here we see those seven bottles of light: the procession, the narthex, the baptistry, the sanctuary and the altar, the communion, the confession, and the choir. And then the shape of all of those pieces is celebrating the procession here, the sanctuary there. This one is through the communion. So that's really the concept for the building. And then after that, he's simply designing each light quality exactly as it should be. So it's elements of form, sensual experience of the form, its intellectual experience of the form. There is this deep kind of conceptual framework that it's working from, an underlying structure there. And then it employs many of the sources of form that we talked about. Geometric sources of form are through the whole building. Basically, this rectangular site with this rectangular container is very strong geometry. The pool itself is perfect rectilinear geometry. There also is, in that front entry, that is a golden proportion right there. And then he pulls out that square out of the golden proportion and leaves a vertical golden proportion, exactly as we saw that interesting puzzle that the square and the golden proportion can create between each other. So he uses these very strong geometries throughout the building, the windows, the insets and the plaster, many elements that really emphasize crisp, clean geometry. Even in the baptistry area there, that the little font is a segment of a sphere and the circle on the top. He even sort of looks at the cross which can be ornamented any number of ways, but when you take it down to its very most spare elements, it's, of course, geometrical. So over and over in the building, we're seeing that powerful geometry. Even that door that opens into the confessional area, just pulling that corner loose in the door emphasizes the geometry there. The art glass has strong geometrical shapes in it. Even love, I'm going to see if I can get back to this moment right there. That altar is fantastic. It's just a simple plane on 4 legs. The 4 legs, however, make the alpha and the omega. Alpha and omega are the beginning and end of the Greek alphabet. Christ said, I'm the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. So he puts the alpha and omega there, but in a very geometricized form to become really the legs of the altar. So over and over we see geometry being employed, but also we see these more organic shapes. And often the organic shapes are to bring light in a very smooth, even way, as here in the communion area right there, or in the processional area right there. So it's a way of bouncing and bringing the light into the building. But again, now it's organic sources of form that are more appropriate than geometric forms. The front door is really wonderful here. It's made out of a local wood that is characteristic of Washington State. And instead of just sawn surface on the wood, it's a hewn surface so that you see more the actual organic texture of the wood itself. These openings are in the shape of the seed pod of that particular tree, and they're more organic forms. The pull on that door is a little more like the shape of your hand. You can reach and grab it with your hand very naturally, your organic hand interacting with that organic shape of the pull. There's also something in that pull that kind of reminds you of the vestments of a priest, how a shawl falls over the shoulder. Again, organic shapes in the human body. But there are many different elements in the building that are from more natural sources of form. He uses a lot of kind of custom-made glass pieces in the building, and they're in a very loose, organic form. There's a lot of art glass produced in Seattle. They have a very sophisticated glass-making community. And so he's taking full advantage of those artisans. And in this case, it's the shape that the glass takes when it's liquid and you blow it, and just that bulbous shape, which is a natural shape of that glass when air is applied to it, that creates the shape of that light fixture. This one, you can see all the cracks as the glass is cooling. It naturally cracks, and they just say, fine, let it crack. Let it express its native qualities. And that becomes a kind of feature in making the light fixture. So over and over in the building, you see in the communion area, there's actually a branch of a tree that's integrated into that space. Handrails become these things that are both about kind of flow in your hand as it moves up, but now a softer, irregular, organic form. So he's playing off each other, the organic shapes and forms, the strong geometrical forms. I love there are 2 little islands in that pool. Both of them are perfect squares. One of them then, with that geometry, places vegetation there. The other one with that perfect geometry places a stone that's from a mountain nearby. So you get that contrast between the very geometrical and the very organic shapes and forms. Now, the bottom line of all this is that this is just a very beautiful, very inspiring building. And it becomes that by this very sophisticated use of form. I've been to this building several times. One time, the priest that had been the client and is still the priest that serves in the chapel took me through the building. And you know, all those intellectual sources of form were so meaningful to him. And he's just all over the embedding of St. Ignatius and all those things into the building. And it's wonderful to have a building where he can make lessons out of the form of that building. The other time when I was there, or another time when I was there with my brother. I've made a complete architecture junkie out of my brother, and he loves to travel and look at buildings. So we were in Seattle, and we were looking at a lot of different buildings. And I saved this one for the last building we'd see. We had a plane to catch on Sunday afternoon. And I thought, well, it'd be wonderful to go here for the services Sunday morning and see the building in action. So we got there maybe an hour before the service was to begin, and the choir was practicing over in the choir space there, and they had a beautiful choir, and the acoustics are wonderful, and the sound was amazing inside the building. And we're just walking around inside and outside, and my brother just went nuts. He just said, "This is such a beautiful, beautiful building." And you know, we were planning to not actually stay for the service, just see the beginning and then leave and catch our plane. But he said, you know, we can't walk out. I want to stay. So we stayed for the rest of the service, barely made our plane. But in action, with the sound and with the people and with the message, it's a really wonderful and appropriate set of forms. And those forms are really inspiring and have done exactly what that university wanted. Made the chapel a very special and wonderful place on that campus. So the second building I want us to look at is a museum in Kanazawa on the west coast of Japan. The architect for this is Kazuo Seijima. We looked at a building earlier that she did in Germany. Again, she's one of the most outstanding 21st century women architects. This one is in a very prominent location in the city. This is a medium-sized city on the west coast of Japan. And it's approached really from all sides. So the city, there's a historic palace, there's a historic garden, the city hall is right nearby. There are many landmarks that are appropriate to come to the building from all those different directions. And so it's kind of in a park, and the building becomes this perfect circle so that it addresses all of those things equally and can be entered in many different ways. And then inside are all of these galleries of many different shapes and forms. Obviously, the geometry of the circle being very prominent here. Inside there's squares, many squares of different sides. There double squares, there's circles of galleries inside. They're golden sections. So all of these are actual, rooms for display of the art on the inside. And then in between, it's a very organic movement in, around, and through those galleries. And because it is in this kind of crossroads site, generally you can walk through the building without paying entry. So you can walk like this. And then they may close off a certain number of galleries that are there for an exhibit, and that may have some admission to it, but it's extremely flexible in the way the building works. But it's from the outside, welcoming from all sides. You get the sense of all of these galleries, each of them specific forms and shapes and sizes within. There's one moment where you do kind of enter axially into the building. Otherwise, it just kind of sits in this big park like that. Obviously, very strong geometric sources of form, but also with these beautiful vines that kind of merge it into the ground, it almost becomes an extension of the ground and more an organic shape, almost like a little hill in the center of that park. And these vines are morning glories, so that at certain times of the day, the flowers all open up and it's very colorful. At other times of the day, they close down and it's very green, like the lawn. Those vines then create a space between them and the glass of that big circle. And there's all kinds of reflections that go on in that space. And then that tempers the light as it comes in and creates this kind of cacophony of light and color and reflection of the organic vines and the geometric shape of the glass all working together. This actually was a collaboration between Kazuo Seijima and an artist who also had input on this. Many of the elements of this building have both an artist's hand and the architect's hand, but really making this kind of magical architectural form. And as I said, people just kind of walk through the building. You don't have to be going to the museum to experience it. And these beautiful combinations of light, color, space, shape, geometry, organic, all of those things working beautifully together to make an extraordinary experience of just walking through the museum, apart from going into the galleries and seeing the art that's displayed there. And then the galleries are very, very different. They're perfect kind of neutral vessels for the art to go into. So they have natural light at the top that is very, very carefully screened for UV light, so that it lets just a very healthy light into that art space and makes the art really stand out. Not the architecture is not front and center here, it's letting the art be front and center. And in those spaces, the art looks really amazing, beautifully lit from the top. So it is all of these things we've been talking about. It's geometry, it's organic, it's sensual. It also has a kind of intellectual content to it. As you're wandering through there, you're seeing various intellectually oriented pieces of art, and you stumble on this one piece that again was a collaboration between an artist and the architect, where there's a swimming pool in one of the courtyards. And when you look down in that swimming pool, you see people under the water there, only they're not in their bathing togs and wet, they're in their street clothes and perfectly dry. And if you go on the lower level, you actually can walk into that space and see up and see this little layer of water. And it starts to really, play with your head in terms of perception and depth and space and water. And so, again, a kind of intellectual expression there in the experience of the museum. And it lets you see that bridge between form in architecture and form in art, both of them working together now spatially, very at an architectural scale to make that statement. But again, as in the case of St. Ignatius, this is a building that is just sophisticated in terms of form at every level. It deals with all of the things we talked about. Very strong conceptually, very strong intellectually, a real fantastic sensual experience. And in the end, just an amazing building in terms of form. Okay, see you next time.